say curiosity killed the cat, but what about a human? What would happen to them if they were too curious? Would they also die? Well, that's exactly what happened to Emily. One dark and stormy night, Emily was moving into an old abandoned house at the edge of the woods. She had always been curious about that house because no one ever stayed past midnight there. Even the bravest of the people refused to go anywhere near it after sunset. The locals said it was haunted by ghosts that would drag anyone who stayed over the threshold into the afterlife. And even now, while Emily was walking toward the porch, she could hear their moans and sobs in the wind. But she knew those were just stories told to scare kids. There were no such things as ghosts. So she walked up the creaky steps and rang the doorbell. Inside, the house was dusty and dark, and the only light came from the flashes of lightning outside. Still, Emily was determined to make this place her home, so she started unpacking her boxes and getting comfortable. Every so often, she would hear a strange noise or feel a sudden chill, but she just blamed it on the old age of the house and the storm outside. As the hours passed, she found herself humming along to her favourite tunes, and soon enough, she even broke into a smile. It wasn't until the clock chimed midnight that the nightmare began. The moment the last stroke faded into silence, a cold wind swept through the house, extinguishing all the candles and making the portraits hanging on the walls appear as though they were staring right at her in the darkness. Then she heard it, a faint whispering coming from the walls, like the murmur of voices from beyond the grave. At first, she thought it was the wind. After all, it was a storm out there, and she had heard similar sounds when she was younger. But then the whispering grew louder, and she realised it was coming from inside the house. They were whispers of despair, of agony, of terror, and yet they were also sweet whispers of love, of hope, and of happiness. Confused and frightened, Emily tried to calm herself down. Maybe she had just imagined it. But then she heard her name being called out in the same voice. Emily, Emily. Each whisper contained her name, and it seemed as if the house itself was trying to speak to her. Paralysed by fear, she couldn't move or make a sound. And so the voices continued to grow louder until they filled every corner of the room. Finally, when she couldn't take it anymore, she screamed and ran to the front door. But when she touched the knob, it was freezing cold, and when she turned it, it wouldn't open. She tried to push it, to batter it down, but the door was locked from the outside, as if someone didn't want her to leave. Outside, the storm was raging, and she could hear the wind howling like a wounded animal. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the worried faces of the townspeople peering through the windows. They were trying to help her, but she couldn't let them in. If she did, the ghosts would sense her fear and use it against her. She needed to calm down and think of a plan. But then she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, and she whirled around to find the source. But there was nothing there, except for a few cobwebs. Just when she thought it was safe to move on, another cold hand touched her arm. Startled, she looked back, and this time she saw the apparition of a little girl standing behind her, her eyes wide with terror. Before Emily could utter a word, the ghost vanished, leaving behind a whisper that echoed through the room. "Get out while you can. You shouldn't be here." Then the candles flickered back to life, revealing more apparitions floating around the room, each trying to convey a message to her. Some pointed toward the door, urging her to leave, while others showed her gruesome wounds or clutched at their throats as if in pain. Still trembling, Emily made a dash for the door, but as she reached out to grab it, a tall, gaunt man blocked her way. His skin was as pale as snow, and his eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he pointed toward the stairs and shook his head slowly. Emily hesitated, torn between her desire to escape and her morbid curiosity. What did the ghost want her to do? Go upstairs? She looked at the faces of the other ghosts, and some of them seemed to urge her forward, almost as if they wanted her to join them. But as she took a step up the stairs, they all vanished, leaving her alone in the darkness once again. This time, the silence was deafening, and she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The air grew colder, and she could feel the presence of the ghosts all around her, watching her every move. She continued to climb the stairs, each step creaking ominously under her weight. Suddenly, the floor beneath her feet gave way, and she found herself falling into a bottomless darkness. Just before she lost consciousness, she could have sworn she heard the ghost of the little girl from before whisper, "I tried to warn you," before everything went black. The next morning, the townspeople gathered outside the house to see if Emily had managed to escape. The storm had passed. An array of sunlight illuminated the dusty windows of the house, but inside there was no sign of Emily. The only sound that greeted them was the faint whispering carried by the wind, the same whispering that had driven Emily to her doom. The townspeople exchanged uneasy glances. They had warned her not to stay past midnight, but she hadn't listened. Now, like so many others before her, she had become another victim of the house's curse. Years passed, and the house continued to stand at the edge of the woods, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. One day, a new family moved into town, and among them was a young boy named Thomas, who was fascinated by the old abandoned house. He had heard the stories about it from the locals, and he couldn't resist the urge to explore. Despite his mother's warnings, he slipped out of the house and headed toward the forbidden abode. As he neared the house, he could hear the wind whispering through the trees, and he could swear he heard voices calling his name. But he pushed on, his curiosity getting the better of him. When he reached the porch, he noticed that the door was slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the house was dark and dusty, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. But Thomas was undeterred. He explored the rooms, each one more dilapidated than the last, until he came across a diary lying on a table. The leather cover was worn and faded, but the pages inside were still intact. As he read through the diary, he discovered the story of Emily and the other souls who had met their demise in the house. He learned about their tragic fates and the whispers that had lured them to their doom. Terrified, Thomas ran to the door, but it was locked. He pounded on it, but his cries for help were lost in the wind. Suddenly, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he whirled around to find the ghost of Emily standing behind him. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and she mouthed the words, "Don't stay," before vanishing into thin air. Just then, the floor beneath Thomas's feet gave way, and he found himself falling into the darkness. As he tumbled down, he could hear the ghostly whispers growing louder and louder until they consumed him completely. And so, the cycle continued. Another soul had been trapped in the house forever. The townspeople arrived too late. Once again, they found no sign of Thomas.